Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Hey YouTube, we're usually all about giving you something for the ears and the eyes, but today we're bringing you an audio-only episode. Here's Kevin Hirten.
Today, life inside the so-called coup belt.
Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Niger, and Gabon are all now being run by military leaders after the army kicked out the civilian government.
Why have the 2020s been so unstable in the Sahel? And what could lie ahead for the rest of the decade? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
Of course, you could call it a wave of coup, but you could also see it in terms of a wave of discontent in the way democracy was operating in this region.
The Sahel is a strip of land stretching eastward from the Atlantic Ocean across the south edge of the Sahara Desert. It's been mired in political turmoil. More than 10 coup attempts have rocked Central and West Africa since 2020. Nicolas Haque has covered them all.
I'm a correspondent for Al Jazeera English, and I live in Dakar, Senegal, covering the region.
So, Nicolas, I think it's fair to say that the Sahel is one of the most consequential and least understood regions on Earth. You've been a roving news correspondent in the Sahel for a long time now. You know it intimately, but it is such a big and complicated place. For people who don't know much about it, what does the Sahel mean to you?
The Sahel is, for thousands of years, the place in which people, it's kind of the highways through the deserts. People use the Sahel and the Sahara Desert to trade. And so when you think of the Sahel, you think of deserts, but in fact, it's a multifaceted landscape where people usually don't necessarily live, but where people are constantly on the move, adapting to the environment around them. So thousands of years ago, that landscape was a little bit more stable to the way that the landscape is today in the Sahel. It feels like the Sahel and the changing climate and the changing environment has accelerated in the past few years, and so has conflict in that region.
So Sahel means something like shore or edge, right? So it's literally the frontier region between the desert and the sub-Saharan green part of Africa. And it goes literally all the way across the continent.
It's quite an amazing kind of landscape that people from so many different cultures and identities share. The Sahel is that edge that is fertile ground, but also a place that has immense history. And people forget how enmeshed this particular area of the world is in the history or the cradle of civilization.
Let's go back to the coup that kicked off this decade, Mali 2020. Take us back to that time, your memory of what was happening and how and why that coup unfolded as it did.
I just remember ahead of the coup, there was so much tension and demonstrations that we were seeing every week on the streets of Bamako. Every Friday, I remember I was live and there were thousands of people that were gathered in the capital of Bamako, at the Nation Square, calling for the democratically elected president, President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, to resign.
I think the people coming out today, the youth, the women, young and old, shows that Mali is fed up. We want to change the system. We want this regime to leave. We want a new social contract to set up a Mali that stands up.
They were demonstrating, and what was interesting, you had such a mix of people there. You had people from Bamako, people from the north, people who were fed up with the corruption, others that were annoyed that the security situation was deteriorating. And it seemed that the government in Bamako just were so tone deaf. They just didn't hear the cry. They didn't hear the suffering of the people they were meant to represent. And so here came these colonels, these mid-level ranking officers, to just tumbled out of nowhere, it seemed, led by Assimi Goita, a young colonel at the time, who just went to the president and say, look, listen, you need to leave. Time's up. We need change. And it was incredible to see a coup. Usually when you think of a military coup in Africa, you imagine it happening at night or with all the streets really quiet. It wasn't like that. There were thousands of people on the streets. It happened in broad daylight, I think in the early morning, or at least during the daylight hours, where the people were supporting, it felt, this coup d'etat.
Okay, so 2020 was a key moment. It kicked off this decade of extreme political upheaval. This has been called a wave of coups, right? You had Mali, then Burkina Faso, and then arguably the most consequential, which was Niger, because that really shattered whatever semblance of political unity existed in the region.
Known for its huge uranium deposits and agriculture, a military coup to depose President Mohamed Bazoum has drawn a lot of attention. I know you're going to say it's just another coup, but this one's different.
Nicolas, do you think that this wave was inevitable, or do you think it could have or should have been stopped?
This wave of coups in the region has to be taken in a context in which you sense that a young population here are just unhappy in the way that democracy or the way that they are being governed, and they want immediate change, and they have aspirations for sovereignty. It almost feels like a second wave of post-colonialism, of people trying to really gain their sovereignty, break away from old systems. And that included the democracies that were formed in the region, or the institutions as they were. Of course, you could call it a wave of coup, but you could also see it in terms of a wave of discontent in the way democracy was operating in this region. I think that was one of the key issues that people forget.
But by the time the Niger coup happened, there was an acknowledgement by the regional organization ECOWAS, which administers or it represents states from West Africa, that something should be done. It's just that by that point, was it just a little bit too late?
Okay, ECOWAS, okay? The West African body ECOWAS. Think of it as like the European Union. You have free trade, free movement of people, except it's led by these presidents that for many young West Africans, they see ECOWAS as a club for aging, corrupt presidents to help each other stay in power. And so they are extremely slow at acting. They are extremely slow at being effective. And even though they put some sanctions, in fact, that a counter effect of making them not popular, because these economic sanctions that were put in place against countries where there were coups had the effect of affecting the economies or the ability for the everyday person to get food on the market or put gas or petrol into their cars. So that really kind of, ECOWAS, this was a big blow for ECOWAS.
It's tempting to talk about this from such a big picture perspective, because we're talking about governments being overthrown, we're talking about military takeovers, coups d'etats, but we do lose sight of the people. And one of the reasons we love talking to you is because you report in the region, on the ground, speaking to people. What is life like now for the people who live in these countries?
I'm just going to single out one particular country, Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, who in 2013 or 14, there was a popular uprising where Blaise Compaoré, the president, the dictator at the time, had stayed in power for decades. And so there was great hope for change in that country. And the reason why I really want to focus on Burkina Faso is because today Burkina Faso is where the security situation is deteriorating the most. And now it is a place where democracy and freedom is clearly disappearing. And in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, there's a film festival called FESPACO, where African filmmakers come from all around the world to make art, to push the boundaries, to challenge leaders. And that very important African film festival that has been going on for decades, that's of a historic importance, well, it's slowly losing its ability to exist for several reasons. And most importantly, because of the deteriorating security situation in that country. To the government, the junta there, led by a young captain, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, they have lost half of their country. Imagine, half of the country no longer in control of the state, but controlled by armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIL. In a country that has multiple religions, multiple faiths, there's Christians, there's Muslims, there's animists. To see that happen in that country is terrible. And the situation is so bad that a lot of people that were my friends refuse to answer my calls now. They're so scared that even speaking to me would lead them to prison. Now, we've seen human rights activists, politicians, journalists, if they say something that is out of the government line or out of the junta's line, they're sent to the front line.
We started talking about how one of the sources for these coups was this sense that the democracy was not responding to people's needs. And you had this huge problem of insecurity, people worrying about their own security. So this is what happens. People choose a strong man who will protect them, but then you end up, it sounds like they've lost any semblance of democracy. So was it worth it in the end? Is there even a way for you to get that kind of reporting, how people are feeling about the bargain they made?
The jury's out. It really depends who you speak to. And all of these military juntas have all promised to change the constitution to a return to democracy, to organizing elections. Okay? So they all say their time in power is temporary, but they've been in power for now a number of years. The biggest issue for people in the Sahel is food and access to water. And you cannot discuss the situation in the Sahel without zooming in on the importance of accessing water in that region.
Millions of people in the Sahel region are facing severe food shortages because of drought.
We're here at the heart of the Sahel crisis. The heat under the midday sun is stifling. People here very badly affected by the drought.
We tell the children we're cooking dinner, but actually we're just boiling leaves. Eventually, they fall asleep with an empty stomach. We have to lie to them to keep our reserves going.
And we've noticed that when there are droughts, when there is the rainy season, that there are the most ferocious attacks taking place. It's really armed groups and the state trying to get hold of assets. For the population, their key issue is who's going to ensure that I can water my field or feed my cattle? Who's going to protect me?
After the break, how and why Russia is inserting itself into the affairs of the Sahel.
Get your news in less than 3 minutes, 3 times per day with the Al Jazeera News Updates. Just ask your home device to play the news by Al Jazeera or subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
So, Nicolas, hovering above all of this is this sort of great game, a geopolitical chess game. There's a ton of anti-imperial sentiment out there, anti-French, anti-American specifically.
A burned French flag, a common sight in the streets of Bamako, the anger on display during this anti-France rally.
And Russia is really rushing in to fill that void. Now, I know you were just in Niger covering the departure of American troops from that country. Can you talk about how things have changed with this latest wave of coups?
Look, I was also in the Central African Republic a couple of years ago with the Wagner Group, which is the Russian mercenary group. And it was really interesting to see them operate up close. It's very different to being embedded with American soldiers, for instance, or the French, or any other nation. They seem to be much more closer to the local militaries on the ground. There might be, like, in terms of the way that they operate, the Russians, you see a camaraderie between soldiers and these mercenaries that I see less of with the French or other Western nations who kind of stick to themselves and maybe do some cooperation, joint operations, whereas the Russians really kind of work within the battalions of these armies.
So maybe paternal versus fraternal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've pointed out, and actually, it's funny that you say that because on Telegram, a lot of the propaganda videos that we see from the Russian Wagner Group is really about that. It's about, like, we're both fighting the same war. We're just fighting the same people. You know, we're trying to ensure sovereignty against imperialism. But just to be clear, I mean, when we talk about Russia, are we talking about the Russian mercenary group, the Wagner Group, or are we talking about the Russian state? And it is always a gray zone that is much to the benefit of Moscow, but also to the benefit of the West. I think both the West and Russia likes to overplay their importance in the Sahel. But from an African perspective, they see them as just partners. And they're actually really smart at playing these two belligerent forces, if we can call them that way, to their advantage. But, you know, they work with Turks, they work with Chinese, they work with whoever.
Well, look, I can understand the anti-French, anti-imperialist attitude in the region, of course, but it does seem odd that you then turn to Russia, which is hardly anti-imperialist in its ideology. Do you sense that this is a bit of a honeymoon period, and that at some point they might not be super excited having Russian squads of soldiers running around the region?
Look, the Russians were really good at fomenting anti-French sentiment. To understand the conflict in the Sahel and why there are so many coups, you have to go back in the fact that these soldiers, these juntas, these armies were so dependent on the French military for their sovereignty and their protection. And they went through humiliating defeat. In 2013, when there was an invasion from Libya, from fighters coming into the country, the Malian forces couldn't keep up. The French had to intervene, and that was really humiliating. And one person that was on the battlefront in Kidal, which is one of the towns in northern Mali, was no other than Assimi Goïta, the current military junta leader in Mali. And those humiliation on the battlefront, the dependence on the French, really informs the decision-making of these juntas. They want to sever their ties. And so these juntas are trying to do something very difficult. Both try to regain sovereignty of their country faced with attacks by armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIL, as well as make constitutional reform, change the institutions so that there can be a system in place, a democracy that reflects their culture.
So let's take it back to what this chessboard means for the people of the Sahel. It's a region marked by extremes, right? Extreme climate, extreme politics, and the challenges ahead are enormous. You are in Senegal, a country that has not faced a coup, but it's had rocky moments, but the democracy is holding. I wonder if there are any examples from Senegal that can be instructive for how the region tackles the challenges that lie ahead.
Well, Senegal is the outlier because it has never experienced a coup. There's always been a peaceful handover of power. There was a rocky election in the last few years. But what we forget is there is a strong civil society, increasingly interconnected, that have expectations that are not going to bow down to their leaders, but are really looking for their leadership to deliver on their promises. And if they don't, they'll hold them accountable. And you can really sense a real shift and change in the attitude of young people from, at least throughout West Africa, towards how they feel towards their leaders or towards their country. It definitely feels like the solution to the conflict in the Sahel, even to end this desperate migration to Europe. Well, the solution to that is a solution that will come from Africans, by Africans, and that it will not involve Russia, China, the United States, France, or other countries. People here are really good at sitting down and talking to each other to resolve conflict. And this is really an important reminder, at forgiving each other. You know, like, despite the violence, there is the culture of forgiveness that paves the way for peace. And so, you know, when people describe this region as maybe chaotic and riddled with coups, I find it unfair to those people that strive and live in these contexts. You know, the conflict is the visible part of the iceberg. There's so much happening beneath the surface. Negotiations to accessing a well. There's unexplored resources in the Sahel. What's underneath the ground? There's so much going on from various perspectives. But there is a feeling that there needs to be a break from aging old people leading young people. In the past, people, because of tradition and culture, were okay with an 80-year-old president or dictator. Today, that is no longer possible. So there's a feeling that people want to have that chance to vote and to get younger people in office, and I think that makes a big difference.
Hey, YouTube, if you like today's show, don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends. And let us know in the comments what you think.